In this video, we'll be exploring the emergence of civilization in Mesoamerica as sedentism blossomed well beyond the world of small villages. At the center of much of our concern will be the Olmecs, especially the two main sites of San Lorenzo and Laventa. But we'll also consider many other sites besides, including early Maya sites, as we move through the pre-classic or formative period of Mesoamerican history. We'll see many sites that are touched by Olmec ways to greater and lesser extents, and we'll also see some sites that went on without any intrusions of Olmec culture. We'll be covering the formative period, called the Pre-Classic by Maya archaeologists. The formative picks up around 1800 BC, and for central Mexico runs until 150 CE, while for the lowland Maya area we leave the Pre-Classic into the Classic around 250 CE. I'll be referring to the period from 1800 to either 150 or 250 CE as the formative. In preparing for this video, I mostly relied on the two sources you can see on screen, links in the description below. The early formative period lasts from 1800 BC, which is when abundant pottery arises, through 1000 BC. During this time, there arose the Olmec civilization, whose heartland initially lay centered around San Lorenzo along the Coatzacoalcos River in the lowlands of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Olmec civilization is most known for its art. Some features found in Olmec art that help with identifying Olmec culture or cultural influence can be seen in this figurine. Note the downturned lips, a very common thing you'll see in Olmec art, and then the flaming eyebrows, as well as the notch or cleft in the head. Here we can see two of the features with a particularly noticeable cleft head. Olmec art often combines human attributes along with animal attributes, and often in the form of fat, sexless babies. Most famous of the Olmec artifacts are undoubtedly their colossal heads, which are generally thought to depict Olmec rulers. At least 12 of the 17 Olmec heads come from this early formative period, and these 12 come from two sites, San Lorenzo and Tres Zapotes. I say at least 12 of the 17 because I'm having trouble finding a date for one Olmec head, this one arriving to us unfinished and larger than all the others at La Cobata. San Lorenzo is the main Olmec site of this period, and it provides a whopping 10 of these head sculptures. San Lorenzo had been settled around 1800 BC and was clearly Olmec by 1500 BC. For hundreds of years, it was by far the largest settlement in Mesoamerica. The site peaked starting 1200 BC when it covered 690 hectares and held some 10,000 people. While San Lorenzo was the main site, by this time hundreds of villages existed in the river valley. One much smaller Olmec site, very near to and contemporary with San Lorenzo, is El Manatee. El Manatee is 10 miles southeast, perhaps half-day's walk from San Lorenzo. Among other finds there come the earliest known rubber bulls of the Mesoamerican bull game. Of the 7 bulls found, the 2 earliest date to around 1600 BC. Another site to the south of San Lorenzo, El Azuzu, brings us a fascinating monument where 2 nearly identical young male figures, taken by some as precursors of the twins of the Popol Vuh, are in a kneeling posture before 2 jaguars, which are slightly different than one another. San Lorenzo had constructed many earthen mounds, and in front of some large ones have been found massive basalt flat-topped altar stones or throne stones. A net 14 of these kinds of carved stones have been found, and like the monumental heads, mostly from San Lorenzo and the later Laventa of the Middle Formative period. One of the stones from San Lorenzo depicts 2 dwarves holding up the upper stone. The other massive stone monuments were the colossal heads. Let's turn to those heads in a minute, but first there's an interesting construction within San Lorenzo that beckons for our attention. Specifically, one elite residence shows evidence of having important stone sculpturing occurring right alongside it. And there may be evidence of resculpturing taking place there as well, where existing monuments are recycled into newer, smaller ones. This residence is known as the Red Palace, named for its red gravel floor and red mud walls. Beyond its association with sculpting, the Red Palace is also notable for its basalt and limestone roof-supporting columns, as well as its basalt drainage system. Also from San Lorenzo, in the southwestern part, were found 560 feet of a basalt-covered stone trough drainage system. Now to the monumental heads, of which San Lorenzo gives us 10, the largest of which, San Lorenzo Monument 1, weighs 25.3 tons, and the smallest of which, and this is in fact the smallest of all the known heads, not just San Lorenzo's, is San Lorenzo Monument 4, weighing in at 6 tons. Let's take a look at all the rest of those found at San Lorenzo now, and you might want to take note of the differently designed headgear and the unique expressions on these seemingly realistic faces. After spending some time flourishing, San Lorenzo declined in activity, population, and regional influence as we approach 1000 BC, and by 800 BC, San Lorenzo and the many surrounding villages had been mostly abandoned. Around 1200 BC, back when San Lorenzo had entered into its heyday, a new Olmec site is founded at Tres Zapotes, nearby to the Tuxtla Mountains, which is where the Olmecs were getting their basalt from. Tres Zapotes provides us with 2 of the colossal heads, including the earliest one found. One side of basalt are the massive sculptures that can be produced. Another side of basalt are the volcanoes that produce basalt erupting and causing issues. And the thick volcanic ash layer atop the early formative Tres Zapotes occupation may speak to why they left around 1000 BC. Some sites of this period, well beyond the Olmec heartland, show significant Olmec influence, such as Chiapa de Corzo in Chiapas. South of Chiapa de Corzo lies the Sokonusco region, where the thought-to-be-speaking Mishezoki and Mokaya had begun using pottery by perhaps 1900 BC, starting with the Bara ceramic phase and beyond. By around 1700 BC, one village was growing larger than the others, Paso de la Amada, which houses the earliest known bowl court in Mesoamerica, an 80-meter-long bowl court from sometime between 1700 and 1550 BC. Around 1000 BC, Paso de la Amada was abandoned. Before it was abandoned, it coexisted with another site in the Sokonusco, Canton Corralito, and from around 1200 BC, both of these sites are seeing clear Olmec style in some of their artifacts. Yet another Sokonusco site is Uhushte, which may have gotten going by 1200 BC. An extension of these early developments in the Sokonusco reach north, where we find the site of Chiapa de Corzo. Picking up in highlands southeast of the Olmec heartland, late in the early formative, around 1200 BC, was the small village of Chiapa de Corzo in Chiapas. They're generally thought to have spoken the same language as the Olmec, the aforementioned Mishezokian, and they began their public architecture early on. As we'll see in the middle formative, in the aftermath of San Lorenzo's demise, Chiapa de Corzo would expand. Moving now to the Valley of Mexico, we have the Tolco culture emerging around 1250 BC, showing social stratification and increased professional specialization. 2 of the major Tlatilco sites are Tlatilco and Tlapacoya. Both of these sites have been largely destroyed by now, and they're known in great part for their pottery and figurines. Tlatilco, which covered some 65 hectares, has also left behind hundreds of burials. These burials provide evidence of social stratification through grave good disparities, and elites are often found with what is known more famously from later Maya culture, deformed heads and filed-down teeth. The pottery of Tlatilco culture is distinct, though some show signs of Olmec influence, with depictions of Olmec motifs. While some of Tlatilco pottery is incredibly fine, most of the figurines that come from Tlatilco are rather basic ones of thick-thighed women, of which we find examples from Tlapacoya as well. Some figurines found depict multi-faced women, From both Tlatilco and Tlapacoya as well, there have been found figurines of bull players. There are also figurines from Tlatilco which show a woman carrying a child in her arms. But the most beautiful piece to come from Tlatilco is a figure adopting a rather strained pose, and the piece is called the Acrobat for that reason. Another attention-calling piece is this odd-faced mask. Tlatilco culture declined in the 1st century of the coming Middle Formative period. Let's now turn to the Oaxaca Valley of southern Mexico, which would soon come to be home to the Zapotec civilization. Picking up around 1400 BC, there are small permanent settlements, with some reaching up to as many as 10 households apiece. Starting around 1200 BC, one of these small villages, San Jose Magote, already counting perhaps as many as 150 inhabitants, grew to be much more significant than the other sites, coming to cover some 20 hectares and house around 500 people. There emerged social stratification and the construction of ceremonial and defensive structures. Some of the homes of San Jose Magote, located some 250 miles from the Olmec coast, specialized in producing small flat magnetite mirrors, and many such mirrors made their way north and are found amongst the Olmec. Picking up in the early formative, around 1400 BC, located in the Mexican state of Guerrero, is the site of Teo Ponte Quanitlan, which would remain a mere village for the coming couple of hundred years. Also notable from the state of Guerrero is the art found at Huixtlahuaca Cave, which may be contemporary with San Lorenzo. The most famed of these cave wall art pieces depicts two figures, one clearly more prominent than the other. Another site, Caminalhuyu, which would go on to become the largest of the pre-classic Mayan sites, picked up as a village around 1200 BC. Some sites from this time do not show Olmec influence, and for a region untouched by the Olmec, we have the early Maya sites in the northern lowland Petén rainforest of Guatemala. Let's meet some important ones that had seen their first stirrings in the early formative. Very early on, there's Nakbe. Nakbe would grow more prominent in time, but it was already settled as early as 1400 BC. Before the end of the early formative, Nakbe had already begun the practice of constructing platforms to build buildings atop of, and Nakbe would become far more interesting in the coming middle and late formative periods. Another site, Saibal, which would have its ups and downs in the future, has brought forth evidence of a small pyramid built around the end of the early formative. As we leave the early formative period, San Lorenzo is a shadow of its former self. Olmec influence has waned, but a new Olmec site would come to take San Lorenzo's place as the Olmec civilizational center. In San Lorenzo's stead, the Olmec site of Laventa, the largest Olmec site, saw its multiple hundred years at the top. The around 29 kilometers inland from the Gulf Coast island of Laventa had a great pyramid, which reaches over 30 meters in height and is estimated to have taken around 800,000 person days to build. 4 colossal heads come from Laventa, though one of them, Monument 3, is badly damaged. Also from Laventa are 7 basalt throne stones, showing the emergence from a cave motif, such as with Altar 4 where the emerging figure is holding a rope with further sculpting along the side, and Altar 5 where the emerging figure is holding a weird jaguar baby. Large stela made of basalt were found as well, such as this Stela 3. There are also many jade and serpentine artifacts, such as the buried dedicatory offerings found, with the most elaborate being offering 4, where many jade and serpentine figures are standing, most of them seeming to face the lone figure made of sandstone. There are also, once buried, serpentine mosaic pavements depicting the maize god. A notable weird jaguar baby from the middle formative was found near Las Limas, Veracruz. This baby finds itself in the arms of a figure who has incised on his shoulders and knees the heads of 4 Olmec gods. The baby in the sculpture has been identified with the maize god, the most important of the Olmec deities. Laventa's time in the sun would eventually end, and having already been in decline for some time, Laventa was abandoned around 400 to 300 BC. Jumping back, with the decline of San Lorenzo and the growth and prominence of Laventa, Chiapa de Corzo grew significantly, becoming a regional capital by 800 BC. A significant royal tomb, dating to between 700 and 500 BC, comes from within a 6-meter tall pyramid. In the Sokonusco, after 1000 BC, the site of La Blanca arose as a regional center surrounded by many villages, and they constructed a 25-meter pyramid before 800 BC. La Blanca peaked at perhaps over 200 hectares, and the site declined after 600 BC. The other regional center of this time is the site of Takalikaba, which, like La Blanca, arrives to us with many Olmec-style sculptures. Takalikaba didn't decline like La Blanca, and instead transitioned away from Olmec influence and is Maya in the coming late formative. At Takalikaba, we see the pink structure, which shows Olmec influence. There's a burial found there with some grave goods, and notably a vulture pendant that once sat upon the buried man's now disintegrated chest from the latter part of the Middle Formative, sometime between 700 and 400 BC. Uhushte, mentioned earlier, came to cover some 200 hectares, and regional dominance arose there by 400 BC. By 700 BC, Kaminalhuyu had grown and their population reached into the thousands. Of particular significance for Kaminalhuyu were the obsidian mines to the northeast at El Chayal. Obsidian originating from El Chayal is found in many places, including the all-important Laventa. Teo Ponte Quanitlan peaked in the early part of the Middle Formative, growing beyond village status, and it's in this early Middle Formative period when they constructed the sunken patio in their central precinct. The two shorter sides of the inner square each have 2 sculptures, totaling 4 sculptures of Olmec-influenced probable weir jaguars. Teo Ponte Quanitlan was abandoned around 400 BC. Nearby to the possibly contemporary with San Lorenzo cave art site of Huxtlahuaca we met earlier, there's a rock shelter called Ochtotitlan which comes bearing art as well, and this art may be contemporary with Laventa. 2 notable pieces are Mural 1, seemingly showing a ruler atop a throne, and Painting 1D, which some suggest depicts a man copulating with a jaguar. An important middle formative site is Chalkatzingo, which peaked in the period between 700 and 500 BC, and evidence of Olmec influence goes back further still. The great treasure of Chalkatzingo are their bas-reliefs, such as this one depicting a feline figure attacking a person. The most famous relief is oft called El Rey, or the King, where a seated figure in an elaborate headdress sits in the earth or in a cave and rain waters the crops above outside. After 500 BC, Chalkatzingo lost its prominence. The Middle Formative saw San Jose Mogote continue to grow both in size and population, coming to house some 1,000 inhabitants. From San Jose Mogote comes the earliest depiction of violence in Mesoamerica from at least as early as 600 BC, accompanied by the earliest known Zapotec glyphs, which in turn provide the earliest evidence of the existence of the 260-day calendar. All of this on a flat-carved stone called Monument 3, where what's generally interpreted as a disemboweled victim is shown. The glyphs give his name/date of birth, one earthquake. Around 400 BC, San Jose Mogote declines, becoming in turn a subsidiary of the new Zapotec political center, Monte Alban. Monte Alban was founded very intentionally and with a significant amount of labor around 500 BC. They had similar architecture to that at San Jose Mogote, and over the coming centuries its population grew rapidly while San Jose Mogote saw its population speedily decline. Another important site, this one according to some not showing significant Olmec influence, is that of Izapa, which is in Chiapas along the Izapa River. Izapa may date to the early formative, but by the middle formative, 600 BC, building there had begun, though most of the monuments date from the late formative period. Meanwhile, in the Petén rainforest, Nakbe. Nakbe had constructed 2 pyramids facing each other, with stucco bird masks flanking the stairs and triadic arrangements of temples atop the pyramids. From Nakbe, a Sakbe, or white road, runs some 12 kilometers northwest to the site of El Mirador. El Mirador began to flourish around 600 BC and over the coming centuries built up significantly, including the construction of 2 massive pyramids, the taller reaching some 70 meters skyward and including some blocks weighing as much as 2 tons apiece. As we learned, Laventa was abandoned around 400 to 300 BC. With the end of Laventa prominence, the Olmec civilization comes to an end and we enter the Epi Olmec or post-Olmec cultural period, and the primary Epi Olmec site of Tres Zapotes calls our interest. Having been abandoned earlier, Tres Zapotes had been reoccupied and they peaked in the late formative. It's most notable for the writing and evidence of the Maya long count calendrical system, and specifically the hieroglyphs on the monument stele C provide the date of 7/16/6/1618, which is equivalent to September 2nd, 32 BC. This is one of fairly few examples of Epi Olmec script or Isthmian script, which can be found on some other sources such as the La Mohara Stela 1, the Tushla statuette, and this mask. By around 250 BC, Tres Zapotes was being overshadowed in significance by some of the sites up north and giving way to the Classic period's classic Veracruz culture. Chiapa de Corzo made it through the end of Olmec civilization strongly, although Olmec-style objects disappeared and many former mounds are built atop of. From Chiapa de Corzo comes a mounted carving, stele 2, with the date concurrent to 36 BC, the oldest recorded long count date yet found. Chiapa de Corzo would last beyond our area of consideration into the Classic period. With the end of Olmec influence, Takalikaba grew in significance and expanded some, eventually coming to cover 4 square kilometers. It housed many temples as well as 2 bowl courts. Though the ceramics remain virtually unchanged, many changes in public monuments are seen, such as with the Olmec-influenced pink structure now buried under a Maya-style temple. Like Chiapa de Corzo and Takalikaba, after Laventa's decline, Kaminalhuyu grew. Their constructions got larger, and captives appear in their monumental art. As for the Zapotec, as mentioned, Monte Alban's population had been speedily growing in the years sandwiching the middle to late formative transition, and by 300 BC, Monte Alban housed some 5,200 people, and by 100 BC, it had skyrocketed yet again to some 17,200 inhabitants, and as it grew, it also increased its control over more and more territory, coming to control the whole Oaxaca Valley and into the highlands besides. By 300 BC, all the major buildings of Monte Alban had been established in the sites they would be in the future, though they would be rebuilt and not realize their final form until into the Classic period. It's during the late formative that most of the monumental art at Izapa is dated to, and let's take a look at some of that now. On stele 1, there's what's likely an early Chalk, the Maya rain god, in this image of a figure with an extended upper lip walking on water. Stele 2 seems to be showing early versions of the hero twins and the raven, Seven Macaw, of the Popol Vuh, where the prideful Seven Macaw sits upon the world tree before being knocked off by the hero twins. In the Peten, Nakbei would last until around 150 CE, when it, along with many other sites in the region, were abandoned. One of the other sites that was abandoned was El Mirador, and beneath debris atop their smaller pyramid, the standing 55-meter-tall El Tigre, has been found some skeletons with spear points lodged in them. From El Mirador, there is a sock bay running southwest some 20 kilometers to the site of Tintal. Tintal is the second largest of these early Maya lowland sites, second only to El Mirador, and it's home to triadic top pyramids as well, including one reaching 44 meters tall. Another early Maya site in the Peten of the late formative is San Bartolo, and from there we get the earliest Maya hieroglyphs with a charcoal writing dated to 300 BC. From around 100 BC, we get the earliest images of the ritual of bloodletting by Maya rulers, though these images may be mythical in type. You can see in this image that the figure has pierced his penis with a stingray spine and the sacrificial blood is coming out. With our first look at early Mesoamerican civilization behind us, when we return we'll run headlong into the Classic period, whose greatest city was Teotihuacan.